Hello, and welcome to Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a look inside America's electoral system. I'm your host, Ben Ginsberg, and each week throughout the end of the 2022 election season, we'll examine the issues surrounding the casting, counting, and certification of this year's voting. I spent 4 decades representing Republican candidates and committees, and this is my guided tour through the election system and the issues which will make this cycle so contentious and scrutinized. Today, we'll drill down on the unprecedented number of candidates doubting the accuracy of elections, who are actually seeking the job of running those elections, and what all that might mean. One estimate from 538.com says that 1 in 2 Americans will have an election-denying candidate on their ballot for a state, county, or municipal office with authority over elections. In one sense, we shouldn't be surprised at that number. Polls showed 30% of the public does not believe our elections are reliable. That is a strikingly high number and is reflected in the historically high number of candidates who have said they would not have certified the 2020 election if they had been in the office they are seeking. While most say they are running to fix our broken election system, it is not clear how they'll do that if elected and whether the cure would be more harmful than the perceived disease. Today, we want to explore those issues, how elections are run, and what an election denier might do if actually elected to office. Joining me are 2 guests to help us drill down on this topic. Trey Grayson is the former Kentucky Secretary of State and former president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. He has also been director of Harvard's Institute of Politics and served on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration as a commissioner. He is currently with the Frost Brown Todd firm in Kentucky and Washington, where his clients include the association representing local election administrators. Zach Montellaro is a reporter for Politico, where he is currently the state politics reporter covering election issues and election administration in all the states and on the national level. He's also worked at the National Journal, and on August 29th, he wrote a Politico article with the comprehensive headline, "When Election Deniers Become an Election Cheats." So you two are excellent people to help us delve into this important and, as I said, unprecedented subject. So let's get right to it. So Trey, let's start off by telling us what chief election officers do. That's usually the secretaries of state. But what all do you do to put on an election? What falls under the tasks?
So the title chief election officer is one that every state has one. Under federal law, it's a requirement. Essentially, that title itself just means you're the person that gets sued if you're not complying with federal laws. But in about 3/4 of the state, that person is a secretary of state. In others, that's maybe a state election director. But basically, it varies state by state. We used to joke, when you've seen one secretary of state or you've seen one chief election officer, you've seen one. It looks a little bit different. But in general, at the state level, states certify voting equipment. They certify election results. They work with local election administrators. Usually these states are pretty decentralized, where the locals are actually kind of conducting the election, and they just send the vote totals up to the state. State also these election officials, election administrators will promulgate regulations that they've been authorized to do that under state law. There's also this informal role, kind of like the bully pulpit, if you will, because they have this title. It's the easiest place for members of the media, for average citizens, to go for election administration. And so you have this ability. You're going to be viewed as an election expert if you have this title, even if that's not an official statutory duty. You have this public kind of persona, and that can help with legislation. That can help shape voter confidence. It can help disseminate information. So there's a variety of duties, and again, it varies state by state. But that's what we did. That's what we did in Kentucky, and that's what a lot of my colleagues around the country do.
Very good. And so, Zach, you've reported extensively on state races, and Trey describes a job description where putting on elections and helping people cast ballots and certifying the votes and getting the duly elected candidates in office is essential. Which are the races that you'll be looking at in 2022 where people who say our election systems are all messed up might get elected? What are the main ones we should be watching?
Yeah, so it probably breaks down into two buckets. The first is the prototypical swing states that we all spend so much time obsessing over every 2 or 4 years, right? There are election deniers running for Secretary of State in Michigan, in Arizona, in Nevada, in Pennsylvania. The Republican nominee for governor, Doug Mastriano, will get to appoint the Secretary of State should he win in November. So it's kind of those 4 core states that everyone thinks about for the presidential election. They all have governor races or Senate races this year. There's those states, and then there's the second bucket, states that don't really get the national headlines because on at least a statewide or federal level, they just aren't that close. But there's a group of candidates running in these states as well that kind of fit that mold but won't get the same amount of attention. States like potentially Wyoming, Indiana, states in that category as well is, not going to have an impact on the presidential race in 2024. We're not watching a statewide race there in 2022, but they are still chief election officials. And I guess, there's 25 states, I think, this year that have their chief election official on the ballot. So if you're in one of those states, even if you are in a blue state or a red state, you should care about who's running your election. But it's kind of that core 4 battleground states that are going to get the most attention going into November.
And also, Trey, talk a little bit about the interactions between the Secretary of State and county and municipal election officials, because there are also people who have questioned the accuracy of elections running for those, much more local office.
Yeah, in almost every state, the local elections are administered at a local level, either by somebody who's elected or appointed. And if they're appointed, they're usually appointed by a local governing jurisdiction. There are a few states that are more top down, but almost every state, it's really kind of administered where boots hit the ground, even if the policies are set at the state level, at the local level. And so we've seen some vulnerability at the local level. We've Tina Peters, who's probably one of the most famous election administrator in the country, is from Colorado, and she's the one who's gotten in trouble with sharing source code, putting it on the internet. She actually tried to run for Secretary of State in Colorado and lost in the Republican primary, which is probably why that state is not on Zach's Big 4 list. And then, there's some other counties across. Coffee County, Georgia is now big because there's actually video footage of somebody coming in that looks like they were taking some equipment. And so there are some of these local election administrators who, most of them are underfunded, overworked, and salt of the earth, just trying to do their very best. Many of them have other duties other than elections. In Kentucky, for example, our county clerks, that's where you go register your car to get a license plate, and you record a deed and get a marriage license. But in states like Florida, that's all they do is the election supervising. So that again varies state by state, but these local administrators play a big role. And we've unfortunately seen a few folks step up or are currently in office who would fall into the category of election deniers.
And Zach, one of the smoke signals in American politics for elections and their importance is money that goes into the races. Have you seen an influx of money in 2022 going into not only secretaries of state races, but also the more county and local ones?
Yeah, it's certainly more than the past, but that's a fairly low bar to clear.
Yeah, I can tell you that from firsthand experience.
Yeah, Trey is someone who's ran for both Secretary of State and other offices, right? And they're just so different scale about the amount of money going into these races that, I've talked to current Secretary of State candidates. They're like, wow, this has been our best, fundraising ever. We raised $1.5 million. In some of these states, that can't buy you a week of TV. When we're talking about multiples of that, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars for Senate races, especially for governor races. So it's this interesting dichotomy that these secretary races are so important, but they're so, like their offices themselves, the campaigns are underfunded. And that's especially true for those clerkship races too. Your clerk, your registrar, where they're elected, things like that. We've seen a little bit more institutional support for those roles, for those elections this cycle. And by there being any at all is raising the floor, but these don't approach the level of a House member or a senator or a governor or anything like that.
Very good. So as both of you have scrutinized the election system and what's coming under criticism, what do you believe the main weaknesses are in that election system, and especially what you're hearing the candidates for these offices say? Trey, what weaknesses are they basing their campaign?
Well, I think what you're hearing from some of the Republican candidates who, are raising questions about the election system. One is lack of confidence in vote by mail. Some of this is, it's ironic because traditionally, and Ben, you know this from the campaigns you worked on in the past, Republicans used in states that allowed unlimited vote by mail, meaning you could vote by mail without an excuse. Republicans generally did pretty well and embraced that type of voting. But with COVID, several states who'd never had this were forced to use some unlimited vote by mail because of health concerns. And that caused a whole lot of people who hadn't thought about it before to ask questions. Is this safe? What are the safeguards? We also had a president undermining it. Another concern that you hear talked about is whether the machines are accurately counting the votes. And we've even had some people go so far as saying we should hand count the results initially, not during a recount, not as a check, but actually our initial count on election night, if you will, should be by hand. Those are two of them, and then related to kind of the vote by mail, you've got the vote hauling or the vote harvesting, excuse me, dropping off multiple ballots at a drop box. The notion of a drop box in general, even though we have them, they're blue, they're called the U.S. Postal Service mailboxes. And then there's also this kind of vague claim that our elections are okay, but I have questions about other states, which is kind of a wink and a nod to some of these questions. But those are a lot of the things that I've heard from some of the folks who are raising questions in the primaries and are now continuing those messages in the general.
And Zach, based on your reporting, which one of those charges, especially in the primaries, seem to have been most effective in resonating with voters? Zach?
Yeah, I think Trey really nailed it. And the first two he identified, the questions around mail voting and the questions around the machinery used to process ballots are kind of the ones that have been most animating among these kind of candidates. And the mail voting one is like the most interesting to me too, because I think there's this mistaken belief, certainly by the former president and a lot of his supporters, but even well-intentioned people, that we Americans as a general practice in a lot of states just get a ballot mailed to them without requesting it. That's not actually the case. There's 50 states in the District of Columbia, and they have 51 different ways of doing elections. So there's no generalization, but most states don't mail voters ballots. That number is going to grow a little bit this year. California's added to that list as a permanent situation, Nevada as well. But by and large, most American voters don't automatically get a ballot mailed to their house. And there's been a lot of confusion, and this is long-running confusion. I'm sure Trey can speak about it too. The difference between getting a ballot mailed to you and getting a ballot request form mailed to you. We've seen a lot of those kind of mixed up over the last couple of years. And some people say, in good faith, or even just confusion, like, oh, well, I got 3 or 4 ballots mailed to my house in my name. How is this possible? When they're not actually getting ballots mailed to their house, they're getting ballot request forms mailed to their house, because in some states, third-party organizations can send them and they'll just kind of drop them in your mailbox. So a lot of confusion with that. And as Trey mentioned too, the machines, that's been central to a lot of these kind of doubts about the election, and they're unfounded, to be clear. There is no evidence of flipped votes or anything like that. But it's been the mixture of legitimate security experts raising sometimes archaic and specific concerns about security of election machines versus the actual practice, that some security experts have raised concerns about potential vulnerabilities in the machines, but there's been no evidence that they've been actually acted upon, and it's taking that leap from these theoretical concerns to actual allegations of hacking that haven't happened, that's kind of kicked up a lot of dirt recently.
Yeah, Trey.
Well, I think that I think one of the challenges right now, we're at this time point where the local election administrators, the state election administrators, they're getting, they've started their serious planning. They're about ready to send out absentee ballots. All the primaries are done. And we've got, one of the things that's been interesting going on right now, actually, that's been plaguing all this. So these are some policy arguments, but some of these folks have been asking people to do open records requests, bombarding local election administrators, trying to gather information, in part because they don't trust the machines and things like that. And so it's just a really tough time for these election administrators right now. And there's a lot of uncertainty with this coming election and what it's going to look like. And so I really feel for these folks, and we've seen a lot of turnover. We've seen retirements at all levels. And so that even if the person who's coming in is qualified, they don't have the same level of experience. And so it's a real shock to the system overall.
That's certainly true. And I want to talk a little bit about one of the ironies of the Republican criticism of vote by mail, which is Republicans have always benefited in most states tremendously from voting by mail, at least pre-COVID. So the impact of that on the campaigns for state races. Zach, I know at one point Politico wrote some interesting articles about how even as former President Trump was criticizing vote by mail, Republican state parties were advocating or sending out vote by mail packages. Do you think that's likely to be a factor in this election as well?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that we saw like a very demonstrated shift of certain populations moving toward vote by mail during the pandemic and certain populations moving away. And by certain populations moving away, I mean Republicans, because of what the former president just relentlessly did. It wasn't like a one-off situation. It wasn't a post-election situation. Running up to the election, just former President Trump, just every possible opportunity, he attacked the security of mail balloting, which was unfounded, to be clear, when he did that. But I don't think Republicans are going to abandon the process either, because it is in many ways, it's both cheaper for campaigns to get voters to do it. The old adage of folks on campaigns is that, you hate getting phone calls, you hate getting emails, you hate us knocking on your door. If you turn in your mail ballot and you show up in the system, we won't bother you anymore. So it's easier to chase your voters. And it is still wildly available to most Americans. 35 states, I think, is what we're at, allow voters to allow any voter to request a mail ballot, regardless of having an excuse or not. Those remaining states require some sort of excuse, be it age or being out of the county or things like that. Florida Republicans have won a series of close elections because they've been really good at getting their voters to return their mail ballots. I don't think they're going to move away from that. They probably won't refer to them as mail ballots. They'll probably be called, in campaigning, absentee ballots or things like that. They won't use the term mail-in voting. But, despite the former president's attacks on it, I don't think as a political strategy, Republican campaigns are going to move away from it. They might do it a little bit quieter, but they're not going to avoid, pushing their voters in that direction.
And Trey, I want to talk a little bit more about the machines and their accuracy. Can you describe the procedures in Kentucky and what you know about for the rest of the country for the testing of machine accuracy, especially before the voting occurs?
Yeah. So, this goes back to the 2000 presidential election, Bush v. Gore, where there are some voluntary guidelines on voting system security. And so as a country, as Congress passed the Help America Vote Act and created new standards, they're technically guidelines, they're not mandatory, but most states, and Kentucky's including, require any system that's sold in our state to meet those federal guidelines. So you have to start there. To have a machine that's used in almost every state, you have to meet that federal guideline. And then most states also still run those machines through some level of testing as well. So that's just to be able to sell a model type. So then the specific voting systems, they're programmed before each election. And so now when we say voting systems, most votes are now cast on paper. And sometimes that's with a ballot marking device where a piece of paper is marked. And other times it's just you mark it yourself, but either way, it goes through a scanner. And before each election, after the programming and before election day, and when I say election day, before the day upon which any votes would be run through that system, there's what's called logic and accuracy testing, or L&A. And in logic and accuracy testing, you run a sample election with some ballots. You know what ballots you produced, so you know what the outcome should be, and you run it through the voting systems to test. It's kind of like test driving a car before you buy it at the dealership. And so you run it through every single the machines, and if it doesn't work, if the numbers don't match, then you got to go figure something out. So that's done before every election. That's usually done in front of Republicans and Democrats, because most of our elections are governed in that way, often even in an open meeting. So before everything is rolled out on election day, you've got the federal certification and the L&A. And there are also, in most cases, machines that have been used in the past. And again, there's different audits and recounts to try to look at that. So that's designed so that we just don't have a fly-by-the-night operator or somebody just trying a new method. And that's one of the reasons why when you see a recount, the counts almost inevitably are 100% accurate when you do a hand recount after an election. We just went through a state Senate recount in my home, the part of Kentucky where I live, and it was literally 1 for 1. It was the perfect match. And sometimes there's a variance here or there because somebody circles a number instead of coloring it in or something like that. But that testing is something that a lot of voters, I think, don't understand the logic and accuracy part that's done before every election to test it out. But it's an important feature, and it's why folks who understand elections have confidence that the systems can work. The other thing, and Zach mentioned some of the potential vulnerabilities, because you're dealing with essentially a computer, and you're dealing with individuals and humans, and so it's like kind of like banking. Like to rob money, you got to go to a bank to rob the money, right? So banks have safes, and video cameras, and die packs, and security guards, and all this other stuff to reduce the vulnerability. And the same thing in elections. We train individuals, we have SEALs, we have all of this testing because we know there could be some vulnerabilities. So we try to minimize the access points. You don't reuse. If there's a computer that's being used to count votes, the only thing you use it for is to count votes. You don't connect it to the internet to check Twitter. There's a lot of safeguards that are built into place that are just kind of common sense, the kind of things we use in other parts of our lives that increase the security of the voting systems.
And Zach, have you in your reporting come across anything that should cause people to doubt the accuracy of elections, or at least question it?
The short answer is no. America has, I'm going to steal a line from someone we all know fairly well, David Becker, and he says all the time that, elections in America are run by tens of thousands of volunteers. There's always going to be mistakes or something here and there. But as far as malicious activity that dramatically changes the outcome of an election, no, it doesn't happen in American elections. If anything, I've been covering election security, election officials now for, going on 3 or 4 years. I've become more confident in the security of American elections for all these things that Trey kind of listed out. Elections aren't just a one-day thing. It's the logic and accuracy tests that are open to the public. It's post-election audits, and by audits I mean the actual audits and not some things we saw in places like Arizona that were kind of made up as they go along. States increasingly now are not only doing pre-election testing of their machines, they're doing post-election testing of their machines, and it turns out the results are accurate. American elections have so many points of entry because, as we've said over and over today, it's a bottom-up system in so many states, but election officials by and large are trying to do a good job, and they do a good job. And I think especially, we've seen an increased over the past couple of years, especially since 2016, we've seen an increased focus on building institutional trust, be it NAS, National Association of Secretary of States, be it more cooperation between states and the federal government, that should give people, more confidence in the security of elections, that a random guy can't just walk off the street, walk into a local election official office, power up the voting machine and do something bad to it. There's many layers of security between there and the casting of the vote that stops people. And the move in America to having largely paper ballot backups is important too, that we are able to confirm in most of these cases, that what the machine said is actually what happened. That's what happened in Georgia. Georgia went above and beyond after the 2020 election and hand recounted literally every ballot in the state. And it turns out that it matched nearly 1-to-1 after the 2020 election. But having those, what should be trust building steps or trust building things in the end to prove that the elections were valid are good and should kind of make people more trustful of American elections.
So despite all of that, there still is 30% of the population, at least, that questions the accuracy of U.S. elections, and that's what is fueling election denier candidates. It seems that we have a system that is not broken, but not everyone agrees on it. So if one of the election denier candidates gets elected, what are the kinds of things that they have said they'll do? In other words, they would argue they're fixing elections also. What would they do to manage to fix it? Zach, you wrote that great article on August 29th in Politico, sort of summing this up. So you want to take the first crack at some of the things we might see?
Yeah, and it varies so much state by state because every Secretary of State has different powers, from a relatively strong Secretary of State office to a relatively weak one that can maybe suggest things. And some of the things that these folks promise are just like not feasible. Things like they cannot individually overhaul state election law. That needs to go through the legislature and be signed by a governor. So a lot of these folks say they want to eliminate mail balloting to the greatest extent possible, and in some cases even eliminate in-person absentee voting and move as much as possible to a single day of voting on election day. That can't be done by a Secretary of State. They can't just snap their fingers, change their state election law. There's many steps along the way. What depending on the state, what can be done, it could raise some serious concerns. The one that gets the most attention is on the certification of elections. What if a chief election official just declines to certify election results or certifies knowingly incorrect election results? We have no real history to kind of go back on that, other than to say that would almost assuredly end up in the nearest courthouse instantaneously. But there's other things too. It's to the degree that a stronger Secretary of State can set election policy in their state. While they can't change the law, can they frustrate parts of the election system? Can they make it harder? Can they decertify election machines or add specific requirements that are onerous? Can they change forms to discourage certain types of voting? Can they make the use of drop boxes more onerous and more challenging for jurisdictions? And I think one of the things that's really undervalued about what an election official can do, and Trey alluded to this earlier, is that power of the bully pulpit. I think we, as folks who think about elections a lot more than the average American, maybe underestimate how much power your chief election official has to just give information to voters. But that bully pulpit power, I think, is really big. And I'll let Trey kind of go into that more, since he had that bully pulpit for a little bit.
Yeah, Trey, now you get to play your own evil twin. And
well, Zach had a great list. I'm not sure I have much to add to his list, but let me talk about some of those things a little bit more, maybe from the perspective of somebody who used to be Secretary of State. I mean, we did actually get a little trial run at the local level of a local jurisdiction in New Mexico that didn't want to certify an election. The county commission that did that refused to do so, breaking on party lines, because it took an affirmative vote to actually certify it. And the New Mexico Secretary of State went to court. Judge very quickly, as Zach predicted that would happen, said you have to certify, and one of the two original votes against certification shifted her vote, and it got certified. So we'll see that. I mean, there have been other instances where there may have been a dispute about certification that maybe is more grounded in reality, and courts have stepped in and will weigh the evidence. So that's probably how that plays out. Zach mentioned decertifying machines. I remember in the 2000s, when the Help America Vote Act was implemented, one of the things that we were required to do across the country was to roll out accessible voting equipment to everyone. The original, what we call DREs in the trade, which are electronic voting machines. They look like ATMs. Those turned out to have some security vulnerabilities, and that's why we kind of moved back towards casting vote on paper with a ballot marking device. And the ballot marking device is the vehicle to have accessible voting. But the idea is to get it on a piece of paper because the voter can verify that piece of paper and you can go back and do an audit or a recount. Well, I remember, I think it was the California Secretary of State, just when she learned about some of the security concerns, just decertified all the machines. And we've had other secretaries do that in states where they had that power. Now, those were cases where they were doing it, with good reason. But it was pretty controversial at the time. And, after I think history bore out that those were successful decisions. And so there are instances where they've taken steps, but there is this, judicial check. There's also the ability for the legislature to take duties away or add duties or give them to somebody else. In Kentucky, for example, my successor had some investigations with the Ethics Commission and some criminal investigations. Ultimately, criminal investigations, she never was charged. But for a couple of years, the state weakened the power of the Secretary of State and created we always had a board of elections that certified elections and played a bigger role. So it already was kind of decentralized, but they made it even more decentralized by removing the Secretary of State as chair of the state board of elections. And so we've seen talk in Wyoming, where an election deniers won the Republican nomination. There's not a Democratic candidate on the ballot for Secretary of State. I think there's an independent or third-party candidate, so that Republican's going to win anyway. And it's Wyoming, where the Republicans must always win. And we've already seen Republican legislators talk about changing laws in anticipation of having this person in charge of the office. So that is one thing that can be done, but obviously it takes time to change laws, and most states have part-time legislatures, and so you can't move quickly. So there are some things that we can do, but yeah, but again, varies by state. And I think maybe to echo Zach's last thing is this kind of symbolic power, the bully pulpit. If the person who's doing all the press and travels around the state is undermining confidence in elections, that's real harm. A judge can't stop them probably from saying things like, that would be not true, that would undermine the confidence in elections. The legislature can't do that, because even if I guess you could take all the duties away, like they've done in Wisconsin, where they still have a secretary who doesn't do much. But if you're a public figure, you can still go around and do podcasts and do whatever and still cause mischief that way.
Yeah, and of course there have been a couple of candidates really for governor who have suggested they would decertify the voter roll and require everyone to re-register. That would have a fairly significant impact.
Yeah, that's a good one. And and it is a challenge because technically Congress is regulating federal elections. And so, there have been fights over the years about, could you have a secondary list for non-federal elections? I mean, practically that's just a stupid idea, even if it's allowed. It's hard enough to keep an accurate list when you just have one statewide list. And if you had a second list of eligibility for local and state elections, which are conducted at the same time. I mean, it's some of this stuff, when you hear people say this, it's just so frustrating to me when I see people who in theory should be intelligent enough to know better. And then voters who hear this like, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. Like, no, that's a terrible idea. If you actually believe in election security, that's actually making it less secure.
Yeah, like hand counting ballots, as we saw in the Florida 2000 recount and every other recount before and since. The human dimension of counting paper ballots is far less accurate than a machine without feeling.
Yeah, and it takes a long time unless you're going to spend a lot of money hiring a bunch of people to count the ballots. And then these are the same folks who say we want to have results on election night. Like, no, you can't hand count every vote, have it be accurate, and get your results on election night. That's just impossible.
I think folks may only think about, I'm voting for president and my senator, but what about your maybe literally county dog catcher, right? Some of these ballots could have 70 people on the ballot. Hand counting that is implausible, I guess, is a delicate way of putting it.
Yeah, Zach, when Ben and I were on the commission that the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. Ben was one of the co-chairs. We went to Florida, and one of the counties in Florida I remember had, I think, was it Ben, like 4 pages of a ballot, maybe like
Yeah.
Miami-Dade, because they had state races, local races. They had ballot questions, and it was 4 pages front and back. It literally took them, I think we estimated, if you didn't know how you were going to vote and you actually like read all the names and read the ballot questions, it could have taken you 30 minutes to go through that ballot.
Yeah.
Wonder why they had long lines in that community. I mean, that was part of it.
That was certainly part of it. So we painted a picture here of an election system in which people should have confidence, yet there is this great skepticism. So I want to ask you both what advice you would give to elections officials to be able to tell the story of their system better. First, Trey, you from the position of a secretary, what should you be doing?
One thing is just to keep in mind that most people have no idea how this process works. They so emphasize the bipartisan nature of basically everything we do in elections. You know, there's at every polling place, there's members of both political parties. They're there counting ballots. They're there reviewing absentee ballot eligibility. Their machine certification. They're at logic and accuracy testing. All throughout, we baked in bipartisanship. So Republicans and Democrats are there together. Now, some of the independents might not like that, but the fact is most Americans fall into one or the other, and that's good. The second thing is that a lot of this stuff we do are very transparent with a lot of this stuff. And again, these are done in open meetings. And I think if people understood, we're trying to show you how this works. We're doing it in front of both parties. A lot of these are now live streamed. People have been able to take advantage of technology to show some of these things. That kind of framing when you educate voters is pretty important. I think the third thing is to set reasonable expectations. One thing I always tell election administrators is when you defend the system, don't say the system's perfect and that the problems will never happen. We have problems on every election day. I remember somebody in the media would ask me, how'd it go? I'm like, it was a pretty good day. But if you happen to be in the one precinct where the machine didn't work at 6 a.m. when the polling place opened, you didn't have a good election day because you had a longer line or you had to come back. And there are always instances like that. And so don't exaggerate the system, which is a pretty good system. And I think it's better today than it was 20 years ago, because then you're setting yourself up to be easily defeated in an argument. Set reasonable expectations, talk about the safeguards, the transparency and the bipartisanship, and that kind of messaging, can work. And I guess the last thing I would just say is just be out there, be visible. This is the role that Secretary of States can really be positive about, is explaining and defending the system, answering those questions. And so our Secretary of State in Kentucky, Mike Adams, Mike's been traveling around the state and hitting every little group for lunch, every service club and every little chamber of commerce and visiting schools. And he gets media coverage everywhere he goes. And he keeps telling that story. And I see Secretary of States across the country doing that. And that's really, really important to help people to understand the safeguards that are in there and why you should have confidence in our system.
And of course, county and municipal elections officials can do the same thing. And
they can do the same. Yeah, I usually, it's harder for them to, frankly, because they have they're busy running the election, and Secretary of States, usually have a little bit more time to interact with the media. But yeah, they can do the same too. And what they can do is probably easier to open up the locals to show them this is how it works. Come here, take them to the county fairs and take a system to the county fairs. Be accessible. Don't be afraid. Don't hunker down. I think that's another part of this is don't hunker down. And the more you talk about this, I think you'll persuade most people, not everybody, but you'll persuade most people that they should have confidence.
Zach, as a reporter, are there stories that you would like to be able to report that there's some reluctance to? Do you have advice for elections officials on getting out the story on the accuracy of their system?
Yeah, so I guess it's kind of bifurcated. I'm a national reporter, right? So maybe it's a little bit different talking to me, but a willingness to talk to the media is always helpful. And I say that a little bit selfishly, but we, the media broadly, can't report on what your frustrations are, be it more funding, be it, hey, like this really interesting or strange rule makes my job harder. I don't know about that unless you tell me about it. So being willing to talk election officials to talk to the media is helpful, and that's especially true for your local media. Of course, I want every election official in the country. You can call up Politico at any moment, and I will answer your call. But talk to your local newspaper, your local TV station, and not just around elections. Trey alluded to this, right? But like, you got to get where the people are. Most people think of elections once a year, and that is when they're casting their ballot, either at their kitchen table or in the polling booth. It's the onus on election officials to say, we actually think about elections 365 days a year, 7 days a week, in many cases 24 hours a day. That I know a lot of these folks don't sleep and just think about elections. So communicate, I guess, with the national media, of course, but with your local media. Invite your I think it's probably helpful to have your local TV station come in and show, okay, this is how we count ballots, or this is how this is how ballots are counted. This is how we register for poll workers. This is how we're recruiting poll workers and things like that. Going out to the community, it's changed a lot, even in the 3 or 4 years that I've done this. I've covered this. I've found it a lot easier to get election officials to talk to me about, the good and the bad of the job, and it wasn't always that way, especially when I first started reporting on this. So, but as important as Politico is, as important as CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, or whatever, pick your favorite national media outlet. It's really hard to beat the local impact that local TV station and local newspaper can have of actually informing voters what's going on, because most Americans just don't know how elections work. They think that they check the box, they put it in their mailbox, they pull the lever, whatever the proper terminology is, and they just think it's counted. So it's not malice that a lot of folks come with questions. It's just a lack of knowledge, and proactively trying to address that is, I think, probably important.
Good advice. All right, so we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like to close with what is perhaps a whimsical hypothetical. But let's suppose that people who are criticizing the accuracy of elections actually win and become responsible for putting on those elections. 2024 comes along. They've had time to reform the system. In a lot of ways, they're going to own the elections in their state. Would an election denier throw out an election result in his or her state when they were in charge of that very process? In other words, the question is, do you see a potential change in behavior and rhetoric from election deniers should they be in charge of the actual system? Right?
Yeah, I think that this is not an implausible scenario. You always think about how people campaign one way and govern another, or you govern and you criticize your predecessor, and then, oh, we are broke. We need to keep that tax in place that I campaigned against. And we've actually seen at least one of the election deniers, or at least somebody who's had that might be an exaggeration compared to some of the other candidates, but one of the Republican candidates has already pivoted now that he's in a general election. So I think it is possible that once you're in office and you own it, you'll see some of this. I think the one challenge though here is the issue of, when my candidate doesn't win, right? And so do they feel like they're empowered to try to save the day for their candidate? But the reality is that there's a whole lot of people, they just won in 2022. Because that's, in your hypothetical, that's how they win. A lot of their colleagues are going to get elected. Were those elections invalid? And so I suspect that we may not see some of these folks try to cancel results, because how do you do it for one race? So I'm going to be, this is me being like a combination of like hopeful and cynical. I'm cynical enough to believe that some of these folks are going to pivot, which gives me hope. Does that make sense?
It does. Zach, you get the last word.
I maybe come down on the little bit more pessimistic side than Trey is. I just think we're approaching what could potentially be uncharted territory. I have talked to quite a few election officials, current and former, over the last 3 years, and almost to an individual, every one of them from any party, Democrats, Republicans. I've talked to very conservative Republicans and very liberal Democrats who are election officials, and all of them want to run a free and fair election. There is, of course, very dramatic disagreements among some folks about, what the rules to run an election are, should be. But by and large, every election official I talk to believes in American elections and trusts American elections. Some of these candidates that we've kind of alluded to just have not demonstrated that same commitment. And I don't know. I don't think we really know what's going to happen in 2024. To quote, I guess, a secretary I've talked to a few times, Frank LaRoe, is out in Ohio, and he always says, the best way that to have somebody who has questioned elections to not question them is have them help run one. And he's talking about local people coming in and being poll workers. Maybe we'll see that on a broader scale, statewide. I think that's probably it's a possibility, sure, but it's just uncharted territory right now. Not to end it on a bleak note, but I think we'll be going through a lot of uncharted territory in the next 2 to 4 years.
Well, we always like to end with a cliffhanger. So this is kind of the cliffhanger of American democracy. Zach Montellaro from Politico and Trey Grayson, former Kentucky Secretary of State, now with Frost, Brown, and Todd. Thank you very much for joining us. This is Ben Ginsberg, and you've been listening to Saints, Sinners, and Salvageables, a look inside America's electoral system.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we advance ideas that define a free society and improve the human condition. For more information about our work, or to listen to more of our podcasts, or watch our videos, please visit hoover.org.